Hi there. This is the People Who Read People podcast with me, Zach Elwood. This is a show aimed at better understanding human behavior. You can learn more about it at behavior-podcast.com. If you want to support me in my endeavors, please subscribe to the show and please share it with others. This podcast also sometimes veers into the political realm due to my interest in conflict and political polarization dynamics. All the topics I cover for this podcast are connected by my interest in psychology and why people do the things they do. You can learn more about my polarization-related work at american-anger.com. If you're an American, there's a good chance you have a good amount of fear about political violence. You may have heard in the news some really scary things. For example, that a large percentage of Americans support political violence. But what if I told you that this problem has been massively overstated by the media and many political leaders and pundits? What if I told you that there are people who research polarization and support for political violence, and that some of them are, like I am, very frustrated with this overstatement? One concern is that the large overstatement of these things can ramp up fear and animosity, and in various ways contribute to a self-fulfilling prophecy. To be clear, in this episode, neither me nor my guest are saying that there's no reason to be concerned about political violence. Obviously, we've seen politically motivated violence in this country, and we've seen it on the rise. Also, even a small number of people who support political violence can have a big effect. And there are all sorts of ways these dynamics can spiral in unknown ways. I myself have concerns about political violence and how it might escalate in some future scenarios. But it's very important, as my guest and I will talk about in this video, to talk realistically about the problem, to not overstate the problem. There are real costs to overstating the problem. I think this is a very important topic, and one that is, rather strangely, hardly discussed, which I think is related to how polarization leads many of us to overly focus on the negative, which in turn can drive us deeper into conflict and toxicity. I hope you give this episode a watch, and I hope you share it with people who you think may be overstating the problem. In this video, we'll also discuss the reasons why this problem is so often overstated. For example, one reason is simply bad survey design, ambiguous, unclear questions, and even leading questions. We also get on the topic of how support for political violence changed in the aftermath of the assassination attempt on Trump. But first, let's look at some of the ways this problem has been talked about in the media and from political leaders. And if you want the resources that I and my guests mentioned in this episode, go to the entry for this episode on my site, behavior-podcast.com. Here's a headline from Politico in 2020. Americans increasingly believe violence is justified if the other side wins. One snippet from that piece: among Americans who identify as Democrat or Republican, 1 in 3 now believe that violence could be justified to advance their party's political goals. Here's a headline from NPR in 2022. 1 in 4 Americans say violence against the government is sometimes okay. In that article it reads, nearly a quarter of Americans say it's sometimes okay to use violence against the government, and 1 in 10 Americans say violence is justified right now. Here's a piece from the Washington Post in 2022. 1 in 3 Americans say violence against government can be justified, citing fears of political schism pandemic. That article goes on to say, the new poll identified a sharper rise on the right, with 40% of Republicans and 41% of independents saying it can be acceptable. Here's a Guardian piece from 2022. 1 in 5 U.S. adults condoned justified political violence, mega survey finds. One snippet from that article reads, most alarmingly, 7.1% said they would be willing to kill a person to advance an important political goal. The UC Davis team points out that, extrapolated to U.S. society at large, that is the equivalent of 18 million Americans. Here's a headline from 2021. Support for political violence among Americans is on the rise. It's a grim warning about America's political future. Here's a USA Today headline from 2024 that reads, 1 in 4 Republicans supports political violence if election is compromised, study says. It goes on to say that, quote, while only 1 in 6 Americans supports political violence, the numbers are much higher among Republicans than Democrats. Related to these views, Our view is that there will be a civil war soon. Here's a headline from 2018 saying that 30% of people think a civil war is likely soon. It all sounds pretty grim, doesn't it? Combine these various survey results with real world political violence in America, and it can paint an even darker picture. It can seem the logical decision to be very worried. My guest is Sean Westwood, who has researched many aspects of our toxic polarization, including people's support for political violence. He's an associate professor in the Department of Government at Dartmouth College and director of the Polarization Research Lab, which you can learn more about at polarizationresearchlab.org. Sean's primary area of research is political behavior and public opinion. Okay, here's the talk with Sean Westwood. Hi, Sean. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have the opportunity to talk with you.
Yeah, and goes without saying that I think your work is very important and your time is valuable, so I very much appreciate you joining me.
I think it's such an important topic for us to take seriously that any time we can dedicate to it is well worth the effort.
Awesome. Thank you. So let's start with a simple question, and then we can get into more nuance and detail. Do you think in America there's an overstated fear of political violence?
I think that there is a dramatic overstatement in the threat that political violence poses to our country and the extent to which Americans actually support political violence. So there are two things that I would say. The first is that the definition of political violence has become very fuzzy. So it's not just violence committed because of partisanship or because of partisan affiliation. It's much looser. It's violence related to race or gender or other forms of identity. And surely those are inherently political. There's certainly a political component to all of those kinds of violence. But it's very different from an assassination attempt on a political leader. So if we're trying to cure political violence in the more narrow sense, we want to target those who are willing to attack members of the other party, who are willing to support those who might attack members of the other party. But if we're to take a larger view of political violence, it might be that we're misdirecting resources. So if we want to stop hate crimes against Asians, or if we want to stop hate crimes against African Americans, calling those incidents political violence kind of lumps those acts in with assassination attempts and maybe misdirects us to focus on the partisan component and not the institutional racism or not the other factors that are driving race-based crime. So I fear not only that we're overstating the problem, but that we're expanding the label to a point where we're kind of absorbing and perhaps co-opting other really important divides in society.
Mm. Yeah, that's something I hadn't even tried to focus on for this episode, and that's an interesting point. The main thing I was going to focus on for this was going to be the many surveys and survey interpretations that have been shared pretty prominently in the mainstream media and by leaders and activists that state there's high support amongst Americans for political violence. For example, often see in the 20 to 30% framing, but also even 40% sometimes in some framings of Americans who have support for political violence. But considering the work that you've done and some other work by, for example, I think it's a Democracy Fund, and then another survey study that I just saw come out recently, those show that it's more like 3%. And maybe you could talk a little bit about the discrepancy there and how you see that discrepancy.
Yeah, so I think we have to just be very careful when interacting with any kind of polling result that doesn't seem to match reality. So day to day, we don't see much political violence. But if we're to believe that nearly half of the country or a quarter of the country supports partisan violence, it's really hard to reconcile that with what we're observing. So I think that that's the first real source of concern that I have with these results. But the second is if you actually look at the questions, they're almost designed in a way to inflate the proportion of Americans who say that they might support partisan violence. So I'll give you a couple of examples. So when we try to measure partisan violence, we try to use very concrete examples. So we're describing an individual who has committed a crime. We describe what that crime is, and then we ask individuals, do they support or oppose what that individual did. So it's very clear in the respondent's mind what they're being asked to evaluate. But some of the more alarmist work leaves that information out of the question. So instead of describing a specific event, a specific scenario, a specific act of violence, they ask more general questions. Would you be okay with your party committing violence if your party lost in 2024, for example? Well, if you think about that question, what does that mean, right? So what does it mean for your party to commit violence? For some individuals, that might mean going and storming the Capitol. For others, it might mean saying, nasty things on Twitter. It might mean going to protests and really vocally attacking the other side. So by not defining violence, you're allowing individuals to use their own imagination when they're answering that question. And it turns out that if you use that very vague question, then you ask a very simple follow-up. You said that you supported violence. If someone says they supported violence, what kind of violence do you support? It's the case that almost 80% will say that they support something that isn't actually violence, right? So they'll say that they support, like the examples I just gave. So saying something nasty on Twitter, or even more importantly, they'll say, well, now that I think about it, I don't think I support partisan violence.
Right. They're venting like they call that like expressive response or something like that.
Yeah, it's expressive responding. So they're mad and they want to show that they're mad. And one way to do that is to, signal in answering a question that they're upset with one side and they're loyal to the other. But the other thing that's going on with these questions is that a lot of them are not structured in a way that gets around people who aren't paying attention on surveys. So if you ask a question and the response scale, or the way that you would answer that question ranges from never to always. And if someone's just like randomly clicking through the questionnaire, if only one option indicates you don't support violence and three options indicate that you do support violence, just randomly clicking is going to inflate the amount of violence that we researchers are going to measure, because three of the four options indicate violence. So you have a 75% chance of indicating support for violence if you're randomly clicking. So it's partially due to the lack of detail, and it's partially due to just really bad methodological choices by some of these researchers. And to be fair, they have corrected, some of those researchers have corrected that last problem, and that does lead to much smaller estimates of support for partisan violence. Though I still think the lack of specificity is inflating their estimates. So that takes us from a world where someone's saying 40% or 20% down to a world where they're saying that the actual support level is around 10%, which I still think is too high, but it's much more reasonable and potentially more credible.
Mm. And I think you found specifically your work, what was the percentage range you found? And do you think that's pretty accurate when you factor in expressive responding and all that?
Yeah, so we've been doing this now for almost 2 years, actually just slightly longer than 2 years, with 1,000 survey interviews per week. And we're able to very precisely estimate support for political violence at around 2 percentage points. Now, when I say that, it seems small, right? 2%, that's not something that we should be hugely concerned about. But I think it's really important to contextualize that. So I'm not saying that nobody supports partisan violence. I'm not saying that partisan violence is impossible or that there aren't individuals who are out there who are willing to destabilize our country. What I'm saying is that it's not the kind of problem where we want to run massive PSAs during the Super Bowl trying to reach everyone, right? It's the kind of problem where we need to identify who these people are and introduce very narrowly tailored and specific interventions aimed at those groups. So it's not a problem the country is facing. It's a problem that a small but reasonably large proportion of the country is facing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's important too, because some people listening to this might think we're downplaying fears of political violence, which, I myself am concerned about those things, especially as they can escalate in unforeseen ways too. But I think the important thing to me is trying to get a realistic and not overstated sense of the problem, because having an overstated sense of the problem can lead to its own forms of escalation and like escalating fears and animosity and all of these kinds of things. And yeah,
I think something else that's really important to point out is that the kinds of people who are going to commit acts of political violence are probably not the kind of people who are going to be completing these surveys in the first place, right? So if you're someone who's suffering a mental health crisis and you're going to go out and attempt to assassinate the president, you're in all likelihood probably not the kind of person that's going to be completing surveys. So when we're looking at these measures, we're probably not capturing data from those who intend to actually commit violence themselves. We're capturing data on those who would approve of someone else engaged in an act of partisan violence, which also I think really helps to contextualize how bad the problem is. So we don't have 2% of the country that would be willing to go out themselves and shoot a politician or attack someone from the other side. We have 2% of the country that would say, you know what, I get it. That was okay, right? That they went out or that someone else went out and did that on behalf of their party. So we certainly don't want to be in a world where that is, a common attitude. But it is important to note that this doesn't mean that we have 8 million Americans who are willing to go out and incite violence in the streets, which is really important in suggesting that this isn't a group that's going to begin the next civil war. This is a group that's going to sit to the side and say, well, maybe I would understand if some people did something terrible.
Right, and as people like Thomas Zaitzoff have pointed out, who I interviewed him for my podcast, it's like we focus too much on these unlikely things and not enough on more like legal and other ways that democracy can be eroded or whatever the concerns are.
I think that's exactly right. I think his work is some of the most credible in the space of partisan violence. And I think what he does that's very important is that he tries to contextualize the threat in the US versus the threat in other countries and the extent to which we should, at least we as Americans, should be alarmed, which I think he and I would both agree is the case, right? We should be alarmed. But the threat of political violence in this country relative to other less stable democracies, it's just not comparable.
I'm curious, as someone who works so closely on this, are you often frustrated with the mainstream media framings of this? Because I just so often see framings of this kind of thing, even in from people I expect a lot more from, where they just take these kind of like 30%, 40% numbers and repeat them, which I think is so unhelpful and shows an unwillingness to kind of dig into the nuance. Are you often frustrated by this?
Yeah, I'm quite frustrated by it. I think the problem is that if you're a journalist and you are telling a story, more alarmist numbers make a more compelling story. And to no fault of their own, journalists aren't trained to adjudicate the scholarly debates, the methodological concerns that I think plague measures of partisan violence. So if they see a credible institution providing what they think is a credible estimate, I think there's every incentive to go with the more alarmist statistic over the less alarmist statistic, especially if you're in a universe where there was a January 6th or an assassination attempt of Donald Trump. There does seem to, I think, be some internal validation of these more alarmist scores coming from really newsworthy events. Mm-hmm. I don't think that there's any malice. I don't think that there's any ill intent. I just think that we're in a world where negative stories get more attention. Mm-hmm. And the best way to tell a negative story is to provide an alarming statistic. And if you don't have the training to adjudicate those alarming statistics, mm-hmm. I don't think there's much that could change.
And on top of that, it might go without saying, but there's also, aside from the incentives, it's also just, people can be biased to believe these things more.
Sure.
Their fears and concerns make them more likely to say, "Oh, that sounds credible to me." This framing of the problem, which I think is fundamental to how conflict and polarization works. And we're filtering for things we find credible or more likely to believe. Yeah,
absolutely. I think a big problem is that those in the media who study or who report on partisanship and polarization are deeply embedded in our political landscape. And I think that they forget that the average American isn't. So to them, it seems credible that partisan discord is deteriorated and partisan tensions are inflamed, and the partisanship has really become the center of conflict in this country. But to an average American who's not really paying attention to what's happening in DC, who's not following Donald Trump on Twitter or Truth Social, their experience with violence in this country is just very, very different. So when a reporter who's deeply embedded in political context is trying to understand, a news article, they're doing it from a very different perspective from the kind of people who would actually go out and commit an act of violence.
I wanted to dig a little bit more into the survey design and language choices because I find that pretty interesting. One of the recent surveys that was used to show high support for political violence, especially amongst Republicans, when I looked at that more closely, I found that the question was basically asking, and I'll quote from it. It says, "Because things have gotten so far off track, true American patriots may have to resort to violence in order to save our country." So they were using the patriots language in there, which felt very biasing to me in the sense that, of course, conservative people who respond more to patriot language would be more likely to agree with that statement, just as if you use some kind of like left-leaning language, you might get left-leaning people more likely to agree with it. I'm curious, do you think, is that an example of how language can bias these things?
So that question seems to be designed to get people to indicate that they support violence. And it may serve a purpose in identifying how easy it is to prompt someone to admit that they support violence. But it could also measure just how willing people are to comply with what the researcher has in mind. So if you see that question, I think it's clear that the researcher is signaling that they want someone to say that they support violence. And there's a real risk that a respondent will try to comply. Well, they're saying that true patriots should support violence. I myself consider myself to be a true patriot. Therefore, I'm going to say that I support violence.
Right. Now, it's a bit leading. Yeah.
It's a bit leading. You can't extrapolate from that exactly how individuals are responding, but I just don't think that that's going to get you an unbiased estimate, a meaningful, unbiased estimate of support for partisan violence. It's going to give you a biased estimate, and it's going to give you an estimate that is going to be, I think, larger than reality would support.
Another one kind of related to that, another question I saw in an earlier survey from a few years ago, which I think that survey was used to get the 30% number that I saw repeated a lot. One of the questions in there was, do you think it is ever justified for citizens to take violent action against the government, or is it never justified?
Yeah.
And the answers were justified, never justified, or no opinion. And the thing that stood to me was, I can imagine. I mean, I think the correct answer is actually it could be justified, right? You can imagine scenarios where it could be justified, and which I think shows the ambiguity there, but also the fact that as we become more polarized, more people are thinking about worst case scenarios, which would make people more likely to say it was justified because they're thinking about worst case scenarios more. And so just to say, it seems like taking the worst case interpretation of that we have more and more people supporting political violence is missing that nuance of other interpretations for that data, right?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what you have to be very specific in asking a question on a survey. So in answering that question, I think you could reasonably say, well, slavery was awful. We engaged in political violence to end slavery. So sure, yes, I think violence could be justified. There are also going to be individuals, though, who are going to put in their own vision of what could or could not motivate violence, and we'll just never know, right? We'll never understand what people had in their minds when they were answering that question,
right?
Which makes it really hard to try and compare across individuals.
Right.
So is it okay to say that partisan violence is sometimes justified? Yeah. I mean, we fought a civil war, we fought a revolutionary war. There was a lot of violence during the civil rights movement, was probably righteous. So it's not clear that that's going to give you the kind of question that question is going to give you the kind of answer that you want. What would be more helpful, perhaps, is to say, if your party loses an election, right? Or
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
if your party is less able to vote because of decisions made by the state,
Mm-hmm.
or
Much
if
more
your party,
specific. Yeah.
yeah, or if your party is
Yeah.
facing specific threats, because then you're asking a question that everyone is processing in exactly the same way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Uh, and one thing I see too, with regards to one-off events, let's say the assassination attempt of Trump, I think that people also can use those events in service of these really pessimistic narratives too. For example, I think a lot of people use that event as as framing that as like a manifestation or a culmination of our divides. But it's also true that just you can just have mentally unwell people who, even in a very undivided country or very unified country, still try to assassinate people. So it's just to say, clearly our divides make those things more likely, but to draw like the most pessimistic conclusions about one-off events seems to me kind of similar of taking worst case interpretations. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that.
I think that's exactly right. So it's also really important to remember that in the U.S., when political violence happens, we all hear about it, right? It's something that enters the public consciousness because it's so rare. If we're to look at a less stable country, I'll pick India or Pakistan, for example, where political kidnappings, assassination attempts, assaults are occurring on such a frequent basis that a singular event doesn't redefine how the country thinks about partisan violence. And if we're to compare that world of just ever present violence with what's happening in the US, it seems like we're over learning from specific events. We're over learning from things that occur very, very rarely. So it would be one thing if there was an assassination attempt each week where we're actually observing clear and consistent threats to the system from violence. But it's another if we see an assassination attempt once a year or every couple of years. It doesn't mean that those assassination attempts are any better. It just means that we perhaps might see a major event that's getting a massive amount of news coverage and think that things are worse than perhaps they are.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And one second, looking at my notes here. Some one thing some people might be curious about is finding differences between the political groups and their support for political violence. Do you have anything to say about those findings?
So it's also the case that most Democrats and most Republicans reject partisan violence. The difference between the two parties is trivial. The average American, regardless of partisan affiliation, rejects partisan violence. But that doesn't mean that there aren't meaningful differences in our country. So young people are much more likely to support partisan violence than older people. Um, those who are MAGA Republicans are much more likely to support violence than traditional or non MAGA Republicans. And it is the case that there are meaningful differences on income and level of education. So the biggest uh, difference between those who support violence and those who do not support violence is not partisanship, which is important. But it does suggest that there are other social factors that we need to consider when trying to identify ways to reduce the threat that partisan violence presents.
Mhm. And this is another probably just pure opinion kind of thing, but something I've been curious about. Personally, I think that COVID and the COVID responses of being locked down, the existential, psychological stressors of resulting from COVID played a role in people being more likely to take violent or militant actions, both in the case of January 6th and also George Floyd related protests. But I'm curious, do you have any thoughts you want to share on that area?
Yeah, I don't think I have any data that would either support or refute that claim.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah, I haven't seen many people talk about it, which to me is kind of surprising because to me it seems like people sitting at home a lot and being more online and having more free time and also feeling like the future is uncertain would make them more likely to engage in kind of risky behaviors. But yeah, I've barely seen anybody talk about that. So
I mean, I think as a thought exercise, there's a lot of credibility or potential credibility there. I just don't know if we have
Hard to study.
the data that we would
Yeah,
want or need in order to really determine if that was
for sure.
or was not a
Yeah.
contributing factor.
Yeah, it's a tough one. I mean, it's most of these kinds of things are the more yeah, ambiguous the theory is, it's harder to study. Yeah. So I'm curious. Do you have anything that we haven't touched on that you think is really relevant and you want to throw in here?
I think the most important thing I would say is that political violence doesn't necessarily prompt more political violence. So the data that we have on the Trump assassination suggests exactly the opposite. So after the attempt was made in the immediate aftermath, Republicans did not become more tolerant of violence, they became less tolerant of violence. And there was no indication that there was going to be an increase in support for retaliatory action. Democrats also reported no increase in support for partisan violence. So Republicans became significantly less supportive of partisan violence, and Democrats remained about the same. So we should certainly be worried that partisan violence could lead to a vicious cycle of escalation, but it doesn't appear as if that's inherently um, the case. It doesn't
Hmm.
appear as if a major event is inherently going to raise the stakes or
Hmm.
raise tensions to the point that further events will
Mm.
occur or follow along.
Yeah, I guess I mean, to share my personal worries, I can imagine scenarios where it's like, no matter which person gets elected, I can imagine scenarios where protesters come out and then counter protesters come out, and there's kind of like this escalating street violence, which could lead to martial law declarations or who knows what. That's kind of like my worst case scenario, and I don't know how those things would play out. But if you want, I might. I know it's really speculative, so feel free not to share. But if you have anything you want to share about your thoughts, feel free.
What's really terrifying to me is that individuals who are at the extremes, individuals who might be willing to commit political violence, are seeing news reports saying that 40% of the country is with them or 20% of the country is with them. And that might motivate them to think that they
Right.
have much greater support than they actually do
Didn't even
and
think
go
about that
out,
angle. Yeah.
yeah, and go out and actually do something terribly destructive. And if we're in a period of upheaval after the election, and if these kind of panic narratives continue to emerge and these overestimates of partisan violence continue to permeate through the media, I do worry that there's a potential that they, they could almost become self-fulfilling prophecies, right?
Right. Right. Yeah, that's scary. Yeah, I mean, I see so many. Yeah, there's so many people on the left and the right I see using this fear of civil war kind of framing, and I just find that so irresponsible. The more certain ones, I mean, not to say that they can't be concerned about such things, but there's a lot of like overly certain framings, which I just find like, yeah, like you said, it can lead to it can help contribute to the very things that people are concerned about, to overstate those narratives. Yeah.
There is a very prominent book that suggests that America is on the brink of a civil war, written by
Was that the
Barbara
Stephen
Walter.
March? Oh, Barbara Walter. Okay, I haven't.
But if you read the book, it's more or less opinion, right? It's her opinion on where the country is headed.
There was
And
one
I
by
certainly,
Stephen March too. You know that one, it was a Canadian
yeah,
Canadian writer, which I found kind of funny because he doesn't even live here. But uh, yeah,
I think it's valuable to have these perspectives, but I think the danger is when you present your interpretation or your opinion of the state of American democracy as a fact, where we end up perhaps being unhelpful to the state of democracy and the state of political tension. So I think that if we're to truly think about the risk of a civil war from a rational perspective, there's very little evidence to suggest that's going to happen. Um, there have been a number of incidents where people have tried to militarize against the government in Michigan and on January 6th, but those didn't lead to coordinated uprisings across the countries. Those were isolated events, and we don't have any evidence to suggest that there is a coordination system in place that could facilitate the kind of guerrilla warfare that would occur in a civil war. The kinds of people who support partisan violence are just too isolated. They're not networked, they're not connected, they're not in the kinds of, I guess, paramilitary circles that would be necessary for a full-scale national conflict. It could certainly happen in isolated locations. You can imagine militant groups in Montana, for example, Idaho, Nevada, Oregon, being able to do something locally. But the notion that we're going to have a national civil war really needs a lot of data there really needs to be a lot of data to support that claim, and it just isn't there.
Yeah. Well, this has been great. Thanks a lot, Sean, and your work is very important. And yeah, thanks for coming on and sharing your perspectives.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thanks, Zach.
That was a talk with Sean Westwood. You can learn more about his important work at polarizationresearchlab.org or by searching his name online and finding his research. This has been the People Who Read People podcast with me, Zach Elwood. If you're curious about the work I've done in the political polarization space, including some books I wrote, check out my site, american-anger.com. I appreciate you sharing this episode, and I appreciate you subscribing to the show on your preferred platform. Thanks for watching. Music by Small Skies.